Good evening, Matthew. Perhaps you'd like to tell us a question that I haven't asked there, but what you do, what's your self-supporting ministry, just really quickly.
So my name is Matthew Page. I'm a priest in Stroud team, and my paid work is I'm Chief Operating Officer of an NHS trust. So I run Avon and Wiltshire Mental Health Partnership Trust.
Okay, and I can only just hear you. I don't know about other people. If you could be a little louder in what you're saying, I'd be really grateful.
I might have to put a headset on. Is that any better?
No, that's slightly better, so that's fine. I'm also deaf, so it might just be me. That's lovely, Matthew. Can other people hear Matthew? Can you put your thumb up if you can hear him well? Yeah, Bishop Robert can, so that's fine. So, Matthew, how did you discern your call to self-supporting ministry?
I think I had the first kind of inner nudges towards ordained ministry when I was doing my nurse training. So started that when I was 19, and I think it was quite early on in that I started to wonder if I was being called to ordained ministry. I think at that point I was doing local ministry team training, which back in those days was quite intensive training, and I spoke to my parish priest about it, and it seemed a bit peculiar to me that I hadn't even started my nursing career, and yet I also had this sense that perhaps God was pushing me in a particular direction, and so it seemed pretty logical to me from the outset that he wasn't saying, you know, finish your nurse training and then never use it. That would have been odd for God to do that. So I think it was just sort of obvious that I was potentially going to live my life doing two things in tandem, really. And the advice from my parish priest, which I always think is quite high risk advice, was go away and see if it goes away for about 10 years. So that was more or less what I did. But I did eventually come back to talking to a Dawson director of Ordained in my late 20s. And then, I was I have to say I was fairly ruthlessly tested in every interview. Those of you who haven't been through this yet, I don't know, it's probably really different now, but you do a lot of interviews, and every interview I had, I was pushed towards full-time parish ministry, and I felt myself pushing back really, really hard. By that point, I was clinical nurse specialist running a low secure unit, the low secure unit in Gloucester. I felt a real sense of kind of duty and obligation to the 12 patients that we looked after there. And again, it didn't seem that God wanted me to give up on that. And I can remember being pushed on it in Shalford House. One particular interviewer really suggesting that maybe I'd misheard, got it wrong, but I sort of found the words leaving my lips in a quite assertive way that I'm not normally that assertive, suggesting that that wasn't the case, and they subsequently recommended back to the bishop that maybe I was right and maybe I was accurately hearing, and God was directing me to pursue nursing and priesthood at the same time.
I'm sorry, it's been such a hard journey. I'm hoping that others will find it. And actually, the story often was to send people away, and they didn't always come back as quickly as you did. So I'm very grateful that you came back that quickly. So what does it look like now? Because actually, that holding two things is quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's looked like different things at different times. So certainly when I was serving my curacy, I was working fairly hard to try and sort of meet the sort of curacy objectives in a relatively conventional sense. So I had my working agreement and did my sort of 3 Sundays a month and 2 evenings a week type of thing. And that was all fairly clear. I think things changing at home and children getting older and stuff affected that a bit. I think what's changed for all of us, obviously, is the effects of COVID. So, the day when, and I'm responsible for all kind of emergency planning and everything in our organisation. So the day that the letter came through to say your world's turning upside down, I can remember that fairly vividly, and I can remember writing an email to all of my clergy colleagues that evening saying, you're not going to see me for a while, and I don't know how long that's going to be. And it's been quite a long time. So certainly for a year or so, I really wasn't doing very much active parish ministry, because I was sort of working pretty full on running the incident response for our trust. So I think different things at different times being kind of responsive to need, and I guess the need for kind of leadership in an NHS trust in COVID also felt like God's part of God's plan. It didn't feel something I should be stepping away from or anything. So yeah, so it's I think now, like most aspects of life, trying to work out how the pieces go back together, recognizing they probably don't form the same shape as they did 2 years ago. So yeah, so I'm sort of doing some parish ministry now. I've also held a role as police chaplain for a while, which again has been curtailed, but that's chaplaincy is something I sort of interested in workplaces and understanding the context that people exist in beyond the parish. So chaplaincy is something I'm particularly interested in. So police chaplaincy has been part of my ministry for a few years as well.
And this isn't a question you prepared, but do you see your work in the hospital also as part of your ministry?
Yeah, so when I was back working in Gloucester, it was pretty clear because everyone knew me. I'd kind of grown up there since I was 18. You know, it was like a kind of extended family type of thing, as workplaces often are. So my ministry was well known, and I was a kind of peer to lots of people, even though by the time I left Gloucester, I was in a relatively senior role. I think in the role I'm doing now, it's a little bit different in as I don't have those kind of long-term pre-existing relationships with people. I'm less likely to have people kind of call me up and say, can you do someone's funeral for me, type of thing, as might have happened in the past. So that is a difference, and I think so perhaps less pastorally focused, but because people don't necessarily come and find me in the same way. But I think there's something around kind of priestly presence and identity in amongst it, particularly in kind of some of the difficult spots we've been in the last
yeah, absolutely.
year and a half.
Doesn't have to be pastoral in that obvious way, does it? So what's distinctive about being an SSM for you? In some senses, I feel you've said that, but tell us what it says for you.
I think for me, it's a real thing. It's not just something someone's come up with or some diocesan strategy that someone came up with a few years ago. It's not. If anything, SSM ministry pre-exists parish ministry. So you know, it's in the New Testament. People are doing it, and there's no mention of parishes and church buildings and village halls and PCCs, but there is, you know, Paul held his work as a tent maker and carried on his ministry. So from that point of view, it's not anything new. It's a real thing, and I think particularly for me in mental health care, you know, I see myself in at least a sort of 600-year tradition, really, of looking after vulnerable mentally ill people. Probably longer than that. I think it probably goes back to the New Testament stories, really. But certainly, you know, Bedlam Hospital in London, you know, was run by people in religious orders. So yeah, so from that point of view, to me, I see the two things as, you know, just entirely logical, and I have that kind of a bit of dissonance and confusion when other people are a bit baffled by it. Why would you be baffled by it? It's perfectly obvious, isn't it? So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matthew. So everyone, you'll get the chance to talk to Matthew separately in a minute. If you'd like to go back into gallery view to come back, and I'm going to mute myself and ask Jade to unmute and spotlight her, because Bishop Robert is going to question her.
I'm on mute. That the great cry of the pandemic. I'm on mute. Jade, really good to see you. Thank you so much indeed for being part of this evening and agreeing to tell us a bit about your story. Let's start in the same place as we did with Matthew. Just tell us a bit about yourself, who you are, kind of what does the mix of life look like for you?
So I'm a nurse. I'm a staff nurse. Well, I was. I've just gone on to the bank. A bank staff nurse working in the emergency department at Cheltenham General, where I've been for about 5 years, and before that was at Gloucester Royal. And I'm also a second-year curate based at St John's in Churchdown and Innsworth. And I'm also a mum, and I'm married to Rupert, and we have 3 children. So yeah, lots going on in our life.
Yeah. So yeah. So Jade, I was tempted after that saying, "What do you do in the rest of your spare time?"
There's not much.
That sounds like a very busy and not least, as Matthew was reflecting on. My guess is the last 18 months for you have been fairly extraordinary months as well, with all that you've been holding in that. So much more we could pick up on that, but we're limited for time. Just Jade, tell us a little bit about how you discerned your call to self-supporting ministry.
So I think the main thing to say is, firstly, I felt called back into nursing because I'd left nursing. I worked for a medical company for 10 years. And then I had a sort of reawakening of my faith. And I decided that I wanted to go back into nursing. And when I decided to go and become an A&E nurse. I used to do intensive care because of some experiences I myself had there. And when I was there working, I was working as a bank emergency nurse. Absolutely loved it, and I just had this real sense of freedom. So I would say first that was my first sort of calling and vocation back, and I do believe that's sort of where God was leading me back into. But the more and more it seemed obvious that I would probably start training to be a nurse practitioner or maybe into a more senior role. It just wasn't where I sort of thought, I don't really want to do that. And what was growing all the time was my faith, I guess, and I was just constantly reading scripture, and I was seeming to get more and more involved in my local church, really enjoying that. And I couldn't really make sense of it, but I sort of given my life over to God a good sort of 5 years before, and I just thought, well, I'll know when something's right. And I was quite, I've been through quite a lot with my previous career with some mental health problems, so I sort of knew not to push it. And it was actually a chaplain. It was an associate priest at our church who used to come and preach. And I remember when my son was really small, and I'd sit in the children's corner trying to keep him quiet, and the sermons just sort of really spoke to me. And then I found out that he used to be in the police, and it was just like, oh my God, there were so many similarities between what I was feeling, experiencing as a nurse, this sort of sense that things weren't all okay, sort of in the workplace. There was something a little bit dysfunctional, and why was I so concerned about it? But then that question of, well, what can I do? But perhaps that was where God was saying, well, you can just be here, actually. And I think my faith was sort of underpinning everything I did. And it was literally as sad as I was in Gloucester Cathedral. I don't know if you remember when Jesus Christ Superstar was on. And I remember just being in floods of tears, and I just knew that there was no more barriers, that was it. My life was completely over to God, and I needed to just stop battling this sort of sense of, why am I digging my heels in? That might be something in the church. Perhaps I should look into it. But I was thinking of vicar, that's not me. my family, my husband's not Christian, so he'll go ballistic and it's all going to be too much, and how am I going to cope? But it was just that once that I'd seen someone else modeling something, I thought, that's so what I feel. I need to have a conversation with that person. And when I had that conversation, it was just like, that's exactly how I feel. And that gave me the confidence to think maybe there is something in it, you know, maybe I should explore ordained ministry. But a bit like Matthew, I went to see somebody who was very, you know, sort of like, yeah, we need to go on this process. And I totally trusted that. I mean, I didn't even know what the word ecumenical was, let alone curate, self-supporting minister. I really didn't have a clue. And it was tricky looking back now, because I was just totally at the mercy of where I was being directed. And then it was my dad, actually, sadly before he died, we'd had a meal out in the Philippines, and he said, when are you going to just tell the church that you have a dual vocation to nursing and priesthood? And I said, well, Dad, it doesn't work like that. I'll just tell the church that. But actually, then after he died, I thought, well, I can just say this is what it is, and I you know, how do I do both? And it sort of became a lot easier from there.
I think your dad sounds amazing, and I think yeah, God speaks through so many people, but I think God definitely speaking through your dad on there, and so there are lots of things I want to say, but I need to shut up. So that's wonderful story, Jade, and that sense of that, yeah, calling to both of those things. So what does it look like for you now?
So for now, it looks like, well, it looks a bit of a mess, really. But the only analogy I can describe it, it's like, well, so I'm in A&E, and it's a bit like being an unofficial padre. Matthew can probably relate to this. So you never know what's going to happen, or who's going to want to speak to you, or who's going to turn up in tears, or who's going to suddenly want to almost give a confessional, but it's not a formal confessional about how they just treated somebody. So you never know what's going to happen. And I sort of feel like I'm on one of those paddle boards in a big lake with no direction, because I've tried to find direction and there's no direction. I just go round on this lake on my paddle board, sort of trying not to fall in. And I think it feels like the right fit for me, because I'm sort of comfortable with that. I'm not a routine person. But you do feel like you've never quite arrived, because you haven't got a congregation, you haven't got a tight-knit community, and this is your flock and they know who you are. So the people I work with, my colleagues, because I've been there a long time, they've seen this development, and they've and new people, they'll tend to say, oh, that's Jade, she's also a vicar, because nobody knows the ins and outs of the other words. That's the sort of role I'm seeing there, but it's not visible to patients. So there's no chaplaincy role there. There can't be. Although I find a lot of quite deep spiritual encounters with patients, perhaps because of the heart that I've been given for the more marginalised. And Matthew was saying, for patients with mental health, are sort of those that get quite a rough time actually in ED. So there's sort of it looks feel a little bit on the edge all the time.
Yeah. But Jade, I think that lovely, and that sense of being in the mess of it all. It's in the end, it's where Jesus comes and is born. We're nearly out of time, so I need to ask you just one last question. So this is your challenge. You can put it into one sentence. You've reflected on all of that. What's distinctive for you about being a self-supporting minister in God's church?
I think really that I feel that I'm very much in the secular world, in and amongst people, but I am a presence that sort of, I hope, points people to the ministry of Jesus. Sort of for better, for worse, I'm in there, and I couldn't imagine myself not being in there. And there was, I read something that was Austin Farrer who talked about that sort of being a walking sacrament, that I struggled with that for a long time, because I thought, I'm not a sacrament, and this is strange, but actually it's about creating presence for people.
Yeah.
And you can, if you know people and people, it's an organic role. You don't just sort of go into somewhere and plant yourself. It just starts to become apparent, and that's where you're meant to be.
I think it's brilliant, and I love that Austin Farrer, the walking sacrament, in that sense. We're not, God's present in all those places. We're not taking God to somewhere, but actually that sense of, through our presence, that walking sacrament, recognizing God's place there. Oh gosh, there is so much, Jade, that I'd love to pick up on, but that's been brilliant, and it will be lovely to I know, for people to be part of different groups and things, and to be able to take that conversation further. But thank you hugely. Pauline, I think we're back to you.
We are indeed. So thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jade. And it is so unfair to only give everybody 10 minutes, but that is why you're going to go into breakout rooms in a minute. So definitely last, but not least, when I can find her picture on here, I'm going to spotlight Yvette, and we'll ask those same questions of Yvette as well. So Yvette, tell us what it, well, you told me just now that your ministry's changed, so you might like to talk about where your ministry was and how it's just changed recently, first of all, just to talk about your context.
Yeah, I have been for a long time a teacher in a special school in Banbury, but last July I retired from that role. So alongside that, I've also been involved in our local parish church here for the same amount of time, actually, 30 plus years. Yes, I'll be saying a bit more about how that's developed when I'm describing how I've discerned my call to self-supporting ministry. But yes, so my emphasis has changed a little bit, but it's all been part of the journey, I have to say. So now I'm a third-year curate in Welford-on-Avon, and I'm already a deacon, but I'm looking forward, hopefully, to getting a license as a deacon next year.
So Yvette is a distinctive deacon, and that's something you can ask her about in the room, as well as being an SSM, but we're not going to go into that in detail now. But please note, therefore, you don't have to be a nurse to be an SSM, and you don't have to be in a caring profession either. You can do it as a banker and all sorts of other things as well. Not that bankers aren't in the caring profession. I need to be careful what I'm saying here. So Yvette, that very first question then, how did you discern your call to be a self-supporting minister?
I think with the benefit of hindsight, I can see that actually it's been a process which has involved a series of callings, and it seems that, again, with the benefit of hindsight, when I'm called to something, it tends to end up being quite specific, although that makes it sound easy, and it's not discerning what that specific thing is. So I was most definitely called to be a teacher in a special school. It came upon me one day, and that was where I was heading, and it has turned out to be right. And alongside that, I knew that I wanted to be involved in a church where there was children's ministry, because my focus was very much around working with children. So that led me to our local parish church here in Welford. And after a while, I felt that I might be being called to be a reader in that church. The strange thing about that calling was that I had no idea what a reader was. I knew they existed and I'd seen them doing things, but I knew very, very little about it. So exploring that calling with the local vicar and with others around me turned out that it was right. So I did my reader training and was a reader very, very happily for 10 or so years. and then started getting the feeling that maybe I was being called to, this time the specific thing was ordination, which was a bit non-specific as it turned out, because speaking to Pauline first and then speaking to other people, that calling to ordination grew and was affirmed and became very strong. But I spent a number of months talking round and round in circles with lots of people about how it could be that I was being called to ordination, but it didn't seem that I was being called to be a priest. Lots and lots of talking, months and months of praying and discussing and reading lots of books about being a priest. And then suddenly somebody described to me the role of deacon, as you've mentioned, Pauline, and they described the role of deacon and the community focus. And I heard the description. I thought, that's it. That is what I absolutely feel I'm being called to. And the end result is here I am. So I think throughout that process, rather than, there have been those specific callings which have taken time to discern, speaking to other people, reading, learning about them. But it's really over the years been a sort of a shift in emphasis from that very strong calling and focus on my teaching role, specifically with children with special needs, and then volunteering in the local church. And the emphasis has just gone a little bit like that. So it's sort of just shifted from one to the other. But in terms of what I do, I can't draw a line between the two, really. Does that make sense?
I think so. If it doesn't, people can ask you questions. And actually, I actually have to say that you've been there for a self-supporting minister for many years, because actually, as a reader, you were a self-supporting minister for the church. So what does it look like now?
Well, now it looks, especially since I finished working at school last July, it looks very community based. So I am involved still in services in church on whatever day they take place, and involved in enabling Sunday worship. But the services that I'm involved in tend to have a leaning towards being accessible for people perhaps who haven't got that church background, people who've never been in a church before. So that's the focus of my church-based ministry, if you like. But as a deacon, the picture of a deacon that I love is the picture of the person straddling the threshold of the church with one foot inside and one foot outside. So I'm very much involved in the community that I'm a part of as well. So it will involve me now being a school governor, which I'm loving, hosting school visits to church, going out to talk to the scouts in connection with involving in remembrance events. Over the last 18 months, it's involved a lot of time on the phone, keeping in touch with people. Really, it's about looking for potential links and relationships between the church, the parish church, and the community that it's part of, and looking for the opportunities to pursue those links and relationships and grow them, and hopefully and prayerfully see them grow and develop and become more than just somebody out here and somebody in the church, but more of a bridge, if you like.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And then really quickly, what do you think, or like Bishop Roberts said to Jade, maybe in a sentence, what's distinctive then, do you think, about being a self-supporting minister for you?
I think I feel a little bit like Matthew did. I grew up in the Independent Methodist Chapel and became a Christian as a teenager in that church, and that was the normal model. We didn't have any paid ministers. It was, for me, it was unusual to be then introduced to the Church of England, and paid ministers were at that time very much the norm. So it feels natural from an experiential point of view, personally, and as Matthew has already said, from a model that's very evident in the Bible. So it doesn't feel odd at all. It feels very natural.
Wonderful. And if nothing else, that says you're in the right place, doesn't it? Doing the right thing. So thank you, Yvette. Thank you so much. It's wonderful.